the answer is definitely no. It's not such an idle question if you look at the design of cars over the past dozen years or so. Every new hatchback that comes out is a bit hotter than the last one. Many family saloons these days have a better performance than most sports cars of the 60s and 70s. If that's anything to go by, there's a bit of a racing driver inside every dad. That's one of the reasons why this week we're at Brands Hatch, with me taking a sort of crash course, if I can use that expression, at the Brands Hatch Racing School. This course, this single seat stuff, that comes at the end of the course. It really all starts with a briefing.
Let's assume that you're approaching the corner, that you've checked your mirrors and it's all clear behind you, that you lined it up on the left-hand side of the road, and that you are approaching the corner at your maximum revs 4,000. What's the first thing you're going to do, William?
Brake and change down, obviously.
Exactly. But you'd be surprised how many people want to change down first. Now, what's going to happen if they change down first without doing any braking?
They'll exceed 4,000 revs.
Exactly so. All right. So braking is very important, but it's also important for a second reason, because you've got to remember that in a single-seater, the gears are on the right, there's no synchromesh to help you, they're straight-cut gears, and so if you hammer down here and just put it down a gear and you miss the gear, then you're going into this corner a jolly sight quicker than you ever intended to be.
Once the briefing's over, you leap into action in a fairly hot saloon car, the Ford XR3i, showing your skills, or the lack of them, to one of the instructors here. In this case, it's Tony Trimmer.
Keep to 4,000 maximum revs, remember that.
Tony Trimmer actually holds the Formula One lap record for this particular piece of Brands Hatch. And once you've shown him your lack of knowledge in terms of negotiating the bends, then he takes you around showing you all the signs you have to look for, where you start your braking, where you change down, the line you should take through the bends. And he's incredibly smooth, almost as if the car's running on rails.
Progressive power is the important criteria all the time.
You're coming out of the left-hand side of the bend, yes. And a double bend here, really.
And back to the right by the shell sign. I'm taking around just one more time. Over to the left down the straight. To get a straight line, bring the nose of the car in, over the brow, straight line to the Lucas fork. Off, turn and feed. Never turn in while still on the brakes. And use all the road on the exit. Straight line, change and turn.
That's very late on that.
Now, you see my hands?
Very late.
But you don't, you don't pass the steering wheel through your hands while you're racing.
Good.
Just come over to the right.
You don't brake here, you lift off, you say?
Lift, turn, and then feed back the throttle.
Racing, of course, is all about cornering. And these bends here at Brands Hatch are always waiting to leap out and push you off into the countryside. Now, if you can survive that and rack up enough points, then wait for it, you get pushed out in the single-seater.
To third from fourth for paddock on the braking line, and remain in third throughout the rest of the lap until you reach the main straight again. So you only have fourth gear down the grandstand straight. You'll be preoccupied with the fact that the suspension's moving and the tyres are going up and down, but keep an eye on the rev counter.
Steering very light?
Very light indeed. You'll only need half a turn at the very most at the speed you're doing.
Right.
Okay, how are the mirrors? Are they set for you?
How do we start this thing? Oh, there's the ignition switch.
Ignition
on.
and start button. That's as simple
Press the
as
button.
Oh. You're in gear.
Going to be in gear.
You're out of gear.
Let's put the... And that's it. There's a crunch of metal on metal to get into first gear, a leap and a lurch as the fierce clutch bites your left ankle off, and you're away. But as your foot goes down, there's a marvellous roar behind your head, and the thing leaps off down the track like a plastic teacup, because, of course, it's so light.
You want to change your trousers? How do you feel?
I put on brown underpants. Actually, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I'm a bit problem going into the sun. You can't see the rev limit, so I may exceed it down the straight. But apart from that, it's
3,900.
No, I very much enjoyed it.
Very good.
No,
yes, you kept to the pace perfectly. That was fine.
Yes, I find it.
That's really all we require from you at the stage.
Handling is totally different. I mean, 2 inches of steering wheel, and you're
it's very positive.
you're
yes.
massively oversteering.
Lots of vibration, bits of noise, air rushing by. It's all different, so no heroics.
Right,
No, it was perfect. That was perfect. Trying to supply the power more progressively. I notice you come out of Druids, the power goes up and then you lift off.
Extremely difficult bend.
Just nice and gently increase that throttle and you'll be fine.
You're crammed so tightly into the cockpit, you can just rotate the forearms to move the steering wheel and get the right elbow back to have a go with the gear stick. And because you're lying down, your head's just about on a level with the top of the wheels, and you're dancing all over the place, taking up the lumps and bumps in the track. Meanwhile, you can't see anything below your knees, so your feet are searching frantically for the pedals. The amazing thing is, there's virtually no sense of speed. Everything seems to happen in slow motion. So after about half a dozen laps, you're leaving the braking later, really motoring through the bends, and searching ahead for Niki Lauda. Well, I suppose I have to say I enjoyed that, and of course I did, particularly this single seat stuff. And your learning curve is immense. You're picking up new wrinkles about the track all the time. I can see how you can get hooked on this business of trying to cut seconds off your lap times. To do this course, not the crash course, but the complete course, costs about £500, but you can go on spending several £1,000s, in fact, honing your skills to become a competition driver. I suppose of the 3,000 or so people who walk in off the street every year to do something like this, about 200 complete the course, about 5 or 6 actually become some kind of racing driver. I'm told James Hunt even went through this sort of course. Well, many aspiring drivers will come here to a little company called Reynard Engineering on an industrial estate at Bicester in Oxfordshire, which is indeed one of the UK's, indeed one of the world's biggest manufacturers of racing cars, because of course Britain still leads the world in the building of racing cars. They're all Formula Ford cars built to a very tight specification, deliberately to place most of the onus on the skills of the aspiring driver. So before we look at the cars themselves, let's talk to Reynard Engineering's works driver for this year, Tim Jones, because his career is a typical example of how a young guy breaks into this extremely difficult career. Tim, when did the bug to become a racing driver first bite you?
A long time ago, I think when I was about 3 years old, because I always had a picture of a racing car from that era or a model car in my hand.
And how old are you now?
I'm 23.
Did you go through the school at Brands Hatch?
Yes, I did. I started driving when I was 10 years old with the school and carried on for a long time with the school, working with them.
So how did you get your hands on your first racing car?
I joined the Royal Navy, saved as much money as I possibly could, and went out and bought one.
So what happened? I mean, you actually had a first racing season, did you?
Yeah, I did 8 races, fairly successfully. I had 2 wins, and it went very, very well and convinced me that I should carry on.
And what kind of expenses did you have? You know, who paid for things like your tyres and your fuel and so on?
It was all down to me, and that's when debts started to mount up.
How much do you need, for example, in sponsorship to cover things like tyres throughout the year, transportation and so on?
For your first year, you should be able to run on about £10,000, but not including buying the car. But this year, I'm looking at spending about £30,000. People
say, of course, that really the amount of backing you've got really determines whether you're successful or not. Would you say that's true?
Very true. I mean, there's very many, more in the case of British drivers. There's a lot of talented British drivers that never make it because they haven't got the money. But it would appear that the South American drivers and what have you that come over, they've got all the sponsorship and that gets them there. There are, in fact, some drivers that get there more on money than talent.
This year, as driving for Reynard, how do you feel being in the pits with a crew around you, a team around you, all the car being tuned and so on?
Terrific. Feel like a racing driver. It's very good. It's very different. It's suddenly become, rather than something that I've been dreaming of doing, it's coming true, and it's quite frightening in a way because it's hard, competitive stuff, and it's a business now. It's not so much just a sport and a hobby.
Tim, all the best this year.
Thank you very much.
Right, before we look at the cars again, we're going to nip away from Bicester, in fact all the way east to Hong Kong. Built to a very tight specification in order to allow the driver's skills to show through. All made out of this tubular steel space frame, at once a very simple structure and yet very complicated in the way it can cope with stresses and strains. Really the only piece of bodywork is this honeycomb aluminium here, the sort of stuff that Formula One cars are made of, there to prevent sideways intrusions into the driver's cockpit. Not yet a requirement on this formula, but there as a way really of bending the rules as well, because it enables them to have a somewhat stiffer frame, and stiffness is very desirable because it allows you to tune the suspension much more accurately. At the front end, we've got what they call a foot box or a crush zone to take the impact of forward crashes. Tiny little steering wheel, of course, virtually no instrumentation apart from the rev counter and the oil pressure and temperature gauge. That is the fuel tank, 4.5 to 5 gallons, right behind the driver's back. Engine, they always have to use the same engine in this formula, the Ford 1600cc Kent engine. Indeed, they have to use the same tyres and wheels and the same gearbox. So what can the driver, what can the team do once they get to a track to tune or tweak the car to cope with that particular track's idiosyncrasies? Well, there isn't a great deal they can do, in fact. They can change the gear ratios, have very close ratios, for example, for a twisting, winding track like Brands Hatch, further apart ratios for, say, Silverstone. They can alter the springing, soft or harder springing, again, done in a matter of minutes in order to cope with that particular track surface. They can alter the camber of the wheels, again, to cope with things like, for example, the negative camber bends you've got at Brands Hatch. Once the race is underway, there are still two things the driver can do. He can alter the softness or stiffness of the anti-roll bar that sits between the two rear wheels. There's the anti-roll bar itself. That's its maximum stiff position with no flexion. By throwing a lever in the cockpit, he can progressively alter the position of that particular arm. And there it is in the position of maximum flexion or softness, allowing a certain amount of movement between the two rear wheels in, say, a wet track. If he's unhappy with the braking between the front and rear wheels, then by turning this little knob here, he can alter the hydraulic pressure between the front and rear wheels. So if he's locking up the rear axle and going into the odd ground loop, he can there adjust the braking to his satisfaction. And that's really it. If you've been bitten by the racing driver bug and you want to acquire the skills, there is a way of doing so. There's even a way for about £8,000 or £9,000, that's what this costs, of acquiring a little hot seat so you can demonstrate those skills. Next week happens to be our 100th programme. It's also coming up to the 100th anniversary of the motor car, so we're going to go to Bewley Motor Museum, not just to look at those marvellous examples of the cars down the ages, but to look at them through the driver's eyes, to see how his life has changed driving those kinds of cars over that period of almost 100 years. So see you then. Until then, accelerate slowly. Good night.